When the cameras stopped rolling, Orson Welles carried a secret nobody knew. At 25, he had conquered Hollywood. With Citizen Kane, he rewrote cinema history. Critics hailed him as a genius. But that night, sitting in his studio office in Beverly Hills, a whiskey glass in hand, staring out the window, he knew his career was over. He was only 26 years old. At that moment, a phone call came from one of Hollywood's most powerful men, William Randolph Hearst. It wasn't Hearst calling, of course. He never made his own calls. It was Hearst's lawyer, voice cold and sharp. "Mr. Welles, my client wishes to meet with you." Welles never forgot that phone call, because after that meeting, his life would never be the same again. It was early 1941. Citizen Kane hadn't been released yet. But Hearst had learned the film was about him. No one knew how he found out. Maybe someone from the set talked. Maybe the script somehow reached his hands. But Hearst was furious, and a furious Hearst could destroy a man. That evening, Welles got into his car alone. Not even a driver accompanied him. He drove toward San Simeon, Hearst's massive estate. He never told anyone what he thought during that drive. But years later, he whispered to a few close friends what went through his mind on that journey. "I kept asking myself," Welles had said, "how much will I have to pay to be a genius?" When he arrived at Hearst Castle, it was past midnight. As he entered through the enormous doors, he saw Hearst standing in the center of the vast hall, in front of a massive fireplace. The old man wasn't looking at him. His eyes were fixed on the flames. "Sit," Hearst said, without even turning his head. Welles sat. The two men didn't speak for a long time. Only the crackling of the fireplace broke the silence. Then Hearst turned, locked eyes with Welles, and spoke a single sentence. "If you release this film, I will destroy you." Welles described that moment like this. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a promise. It was just a fact. Like saying the sun will rise tomorrow. But Welles didn't back down. Citizen Kane was released, and Hearst kept his word. Hearst's newspaper empire sprang into action. Pressure was applied to RKO Studios. No news about the film was published. Reviews were blocked. Theaters were afraid to show it. Welles' name was quietly added to Hollywood's blacklist. But the real blow came later. When Welles finished his next film, The Magnificent Ambersons, the studio took it from him. They cut 50 minutes. They changed the ending. While Welles was in Brazil working on another project, his masterpiece was butchered. When he returned, nobody in Hollywood wanted to work with him anymore. He was 33 years old, and his career was over. But the story doesn't end here, because Welles lived another 40 years after this point. For 40 years he remained in exile in Europe, trying to finance his own projects, making unfinished films. Sometimes he appeared in wine commercials. Sometimes he went on talk shows performing magic tricks. But that fire always burned inside him. He always wanted to make another Citizen Kane, and that fire destroyed him. In the late 1970s, Welles finally found a chance. He was about to complete The Other Side of the Wind, a film he'd been working on for years. But this time, money wasn't the problem. The problem was the film's producer. The producer was Mehdi Boucheri, the brother-in-law of the Shah of Iran, and when the Iranian Revolution erupted in 1979, all of Boucheri's assets were frozen. The film reels were confiscated. Once again, Welles was imprisoned by his own genius. On October 10, 1985, he died in his Los Angeles home. Heart attack. He was 70 years old. When his body was found, there was an unfinished screenplay on his typewriter. But the real shock came a few days after his death. In a safe in Welles's house, a document nobody knew about was discovered. It was a 40-page, handwritten journal. The title read, "Meeting with Hearst, 1941." In that journal, what truly happened between Welles and Hearst that night was written. And what was said could overturn Hollywood history. Hearst hadn't just threatened Welles. He had made him an offer. "Don't make the film," Hearst had said. "Work for me instead. I'll let you make any project you want. Unlimited budget, complete control. I have only one condition: you will be loyal to me. Welles had refused, but in his journal, he wrote about his feelings at that moment. He offered to buy my soul, and God is my witness. For a moment I considered it, because at that moment, I knew that if I refused, I would never make another film in this town. But if I accepted, I would never be able to look in the mirror again. The journal revealed more. Hearst had told him something else that night. Something darker. You think you're fighting for art, Hearst had said, but you're just a boy playing with fire. In 10 years, you'll be forgotten. In 20, you'll be broken. In 30, you'll be begging me for work. Welles wrote in his journal, he was right about everything except one thing. I never begged. After that night, Wells's descent began. Not immediately, but slowly, methodically, like water eroding stone. The magnificent Ambersons was destroyed. His next project, It's All True, was shut down mid-production in Brazil. When he returned to America, he found himself unemployable. Studio heads wouldn't take his calls. Agents dropped him. Even actors who once admired him suddenly had scheduling conflicts. Hearst's influence reached everywhere. His newspapers ran stories painting Welles as difficult, arrogant, impossible to work with. The stories weren't entirely false, but they were exaggerated, weaponized. Every quirk became a character flaw. Every artistic demand became evidence of ego. By 1948, Welles was broke. He sold the rights to The Lady from Shanghai just to pay his bills. The studio butchered that film too. So he left. Not dramatically, not with speeches or press conferences. He just quietly slipped away to Europe, where he spent the next 15 years wandering from country to country, making films with borrowed money, incomplete casts, and impossible conditions. In 1955, he made Mr. Arkadin. The studio re-edited it without his permission. In 1958, Touch of Evil. The studio cut it and changed the ending. Again. In 1962, The Trial. Financial problems forced him to compromise his vision. In 1966, Chimes at Midnight, perhaps his greatest work after Kane, almost nobody saw it. He became a ghost. A legend people talked about, but rarely watched. Young filmmakers revered him, but nobody hired him. And through it all, Welles kept working, not because he had to, but because he couldn't stop. Creation was his oxygen. Without it, he would suffocate. In interviews from this period, his bitterness occasionally surfaced. When asked about Hollywood, he would smile sadly and say, "They don't make films there anymore. They make deals." When asked about Hearst, he would simply go quiet. That subject was closed, locked, buried. But in private, with trusted friends, he would sometimes speak of that night in 1941. I keep thinking, he once told Peter Bogdanovich, what would have happened if I'd said yes? Would I have made more films, better films, or would I have become just another studio puppet, rich and hollow? Bogdanovich asked him if he regretted his choice. Welles smiled. Every single day, and I'd make the same choice again. In 1970, Welles began what would become his final obsession, The Other Side of the Wind. It was a film about an aging director trying to make a comeback, a clear reflection of his own life. He poured everything into it. His rage, his regret, his still-burning genius. He shot for years, on and off, whenever he could scrape together money. The cast included John Huston, Dennis Hopper, and dozens of other actors who worked for almost nothing just to be part of an Orson Welles film. But then came the Iranian Revolution. The film's financier Mehdi Boucheri fled Iran. All his assets were frozen. The film reels, stored in a Paris vault, were legally impounded. Welles couldn't access his own work. He spent the last years of his life trying to free that film. He wrote letters, made calls, begged lawyers. Nothing worked. Friends from this period described him as a broken king. Still sharp, still brilliant, but weighed down by decades of battles lost. He gained weight. His health deteriorated. He spent his days in his Los Angeles home, typing scripts nobody would read, dreaming of films nobody would fund. He made money doing voiceovers, commercials, talk show appearances. He joked about selling frozen peas. He performed magic tricks on television, the greatest filmmaker of his generation, reduced to a curiosity, a relic. But he never stopped creating. Even bedridden, even exhausted, he kept writing. On October 10, 1985, he died alone at his typewriter. His last words, according to his assistant, were about the film he never finished. "I can see the ending," he whispered. "It's perfect." The funeral was small. Hollywood sent flowers, but few people. The eulogies praised his genius, but glossed over his exile. He was mourned as a tragic figure, a cautionary tale about artistic integrity versus commercial reality. But 3 days after his death, his longtime assistant opened the safe in his study. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was the journal. "Meeting with Hearst, 1941 inches," was written on the cover in Wells's distinctive handwriting. The assistant read it and wept. She called Peter Bogdanovich immediately. "You need to see this," she said. "It changes everything." The journal detailed not just that one night, but the entire campaign Hearst waged against Welles. Names, dates, specific incidents. It documented how Hearst used his newspapers to destroy Wells's reputation, how he pressured studios to blacklist him, how he made sure Welles would never find stable work in Hollywood again. But more than that, it revealed Wells's emotional state through those years. The doubt, the anger, the moments he almost gave up. There were pages where his handwriting became jagged, barely legible, written in obvious distress. One entry from 1953 read, "Watched Kane tonight in a small theater in Rome, 20 people in the audience. They didn't know who I was. When it ended, they applauded. For a moment I remembered why I made it. Then I walked back to my hotel room, alone, broke, and remembered the price." Another entry from 1967, "Hearst is dead. I thought I would feel something. Relief, vindication, something. But I feel nothing. He won. Not because he destroyed me, but because he made me waste so much time fighting him instead of creating." The final entry was dated September 1985, just weeks before his death. "I'm 70 years old. I've made 13 feature films. I've left a dozen unfinished. I've wasted years fighting, begging, compromising. But I never sold my soul. Hearst took everything else, but he never got that. Does that make me a fool or a hero? I honestly don't know anymore." The journal was never published during his lifetime. His estate kept it private for decades, but rumors leaked. Fragments surfaced. Film historians whispered about it. Biographers hunted for it. In 2018, Netflix finally released The Other Side of the Wind, assembled from those impounded reels, 33 years after Wells's death. Critics called it a masterpiece. Audiences discovered it with wonder. Wells's genius was undeniable, even in an unfinished form. But by then, everyone who could have vindicated him was dead. Hearst, gone since 1951. The studio executives who blacklisted him, all gone. The actors who abandoned him, mostly gone. Welles died, believing he had lost. That history would remember him as a one-hit wonder, a tragic waste of talent. He never knew that decades later, film students would study every frame he ever shot. That Citizen Kane would consistently rank as the greatest film ever made. That his Exile would be seen not as failure, but as proof of his integrity. The journal's final revelation came in its last pages. Welles had kept a list, written over decades, of everyone who had helped Hearst destroy him. Studio heads, gossip columnists, former friends who turned their backs. But at the bottom of the list, in different ink, added much later, was a final note. "I forgive them, not because they deserve it, but because I'm tired of carrying this weight. Hearst wanted to destroy me, and in many ways he succeeded. But he couldn't destroy the work. And in the end, that's all that matters. The work survives. I can rest now." 3 weeks after he wrote those words, Orson Welles was dead. Hollywood gave him a star on the Walk of Fame in 2000, 17 years too late. They honored him at the Oscars with montages and tributes. They called him a genius, a pioneer, a tragic hero. But none of them mentioned Hearst. None of them acknowledged the blacklist. None of them admitted that Hollywood had destroyed one of its greatest artists and then pretended it was his own fault. The industry that made him also buried him, and then decades later they dug him up and called it a celebration. Today, film students watch Citizen Kane and see a masterpiece. They watch The Magnificent Ambersons and see brilliance. They watch Touch of Evil and see innovation. They study Welles as a god of cinema. But they rarely ask why he only made 13 films in 50 years. They rarely question why a man that talented spent decades in exile. They rarely consider what Hollywood does to those who refuse to kneel. Orson Welles was 25 when he made the greatest film of all time. He was 70 when he died, still fighting to make one more. In between, he was a genius trapped in a system that punished genius. The secret Welles carried wasn't just about one meeting with Hearst. It was about the choice he made that night, and every day after, to create on his own terms. Even if it meant creating in exile, to refuse to compromise. Even when compromise would have saved him. He paid for that choice with everything. His career, his health, his peace of mind, his legacy during his lifetime. But he kept his soul. And in his journal, on that last page, beneath the forgiveness and the exhaustion, he wrote one final line. I made the right choice. God help me. I made the right choice. The camera stopped rolling a long time ago, but Orson Welles' secret is finally out. He wasn't destroyed by bad luck or personal flaws or the changing times. He was destroyed because he refused to be controlled, because he chose art over power. Because he said no to the most powerful man in America. And he'd do it again.